Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us for another Research in Focus discussion here in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. I'm Dr Matt McDonald and I'm joined today by Dr Nicole George, my friend and colleague, who has recently published the book Situating Women, Gender, Politics and Circumstance in Fiji. She is a lecturer here in Peace and Conflict Studies and is also the recipient of a very prestigious, recent recipient of a very prestigious ARC Early Career Researcher Award, which we're all very jealous about. But Nikki, this book, the focus on gender, politics and circumstance in Fiji, how did you come to write the book? What are its origins?
Well, I started off, this work has grown out of my doctoral research, and I started off, I guess, wanting to do a comparative study on advocacy around gender violence in a number of Pacific Island countries, Fiji, New Caledonia and Vanuatu. And my first stop really on that research journey was Fiji. And it wasn't long after I sort of started interviewing activists. I guess I should say that that research trip happened only about 18 months after a coup had occurred in Fiji, the third coup that they'd suffered since 1987. So I was there hot on the heels of a coup. It was a very authoritarian political environment. And I've sort of found that most of the questions I asked activists about gender politics, a lot of the discussions seemed to come back to the coup and the environment they operated within. And so I was interested in that they were not talking they were talking obviously about gender relations, but how you discuss gender relations within a very authoritarian and constrained political environment for civil society actors. Then I started talking to older activists from previous generations, and I could see a real shift in the way the language of gender advocacy had been articulated over time. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a real radical politics underpinning gender advocacy, and activists engaged with questions around, Indigenous sovereignty, the ongoing colonisation in the region, nuclear weapons testing in the region, economic sovereignty of so-called independent Pacific Island states. And it seemed to me that there was there were very expansive possibilities, and they yoked those themes to questions around women's status, because they argued that you couldn't talk about women's status without engaging with those broader themes. But in this other environment, in the environment that I encountered in the sort of post-2000 era, it's very difficult for women to talk about those things, and even the sort of much more limited advocacy agenda that they were promoting was seen as politically dangerous by political elites, too provocative. So I became really interested in the spaces that activists operate within. And so this is really a study of that question.
So was there a sense then, that it was almost like gender after the coups and the large-scale political turmoil, that it was almost that, thinking about questions of gender was almost a luxury, a political luxury, that in a sense there should be...
Not at all. I think they really saw the standing of women. They were very fearful about women's security in the post-coup environment. That's been a constant theme, actually, that activists have promoted after each coup. Very worried about women's insecurity, particularly after the 2000 coup, because there was a lot of racial tension, not a lot, but eruptions of racial conflict in particular parts of the country.
I guess I was thinking more in terms of the resonance of some of those ideas within
the broader political climate. I think there's a lot of contention around gender politics in Fiji. I think the nationalist element that came out very strongly, or came out after the 1987 coup and again after the 2000 coup, what really fueled and propelled that coup, has always been very distrustful about women activists promoting agendas that are seen to compromise the integrity of Indigenous identity. So I think more the response was that these types of agendas are inauthentic to Indigenous politics, and so we would prefer if the women that promoted those agendas, they're often advised by nationalist political leaders to to engage in a kind of a quiet diplomacy. That's
right.
what they would like to see. Not strongly worded advocacy, not strongly worded political claims, but quiet diplomacy. And they're often advised by those political leaders that that is the more authentic way to conduct yourself in an Indigenous political context.
That's interesting. You spent quite a lot of your research for this time actually with women's movements, women's organisations in Fiji. Can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Well, I was really lucky to have generous funding to do that. I worked during my doctoral candidacy. I think I probably spent 6 months in Fiji, interviewing women leaders, doing some participant observation within women's organisations as well. I was very lucky to meet many of the older generation of women activists who were really, I think, excited that someone wanted to go back and document the work that they had done in the 60s and 70s. I think, you know, the newer organisations today are seen as very much the cutting edge of gender politics in Fiji and around the region, actually. They're widely recognised as being very important. But the older generations really paved the way for those newer organisations. So, and sometimes I think they felt that perhaps that history had been forgotten a little bit. So they were very excited for me to come along and ask them questions about that kind of pioneering period of gender advocacy in Fiji in the 60s and 70s. And one woman in particular, Amalia Rokatuivuna, who's a very radical personality and well known throughout the region, but she entrusted me with the whole archive of the Fiji YWCA. And we were lucky enough to, at the time I was travelling in Fiji, there was an archivist from the ANU who was there, and he filmed the whole collection. So ANU actually now holds that archive, and it's of historical importance to Fiji, but it's also regionally very important in terms of the history and evolution of gender politics. Sadly, a number of those women have since passed away. So my greatest regret, even though I'm very excited about the book, is that I couldn't get it out fast enough for them to actually see the final copy. So yeah, Ruth Lectie, who was another really important person, died only a couple of months ago. But Amalia was quite ill, and she died in 2005. So that's my one regret with the book, is that they never got to see it.
Yeah, and you chose for the book, you chose a publisher that was able to actually get the findings of the book out there at a reasonable rate, indeed,
Yes.
at no rate at all.
At no rate at all. And the wonderful thing with ANU ePress is that you have the option to download either the whole book or individual chapters for free. Or if you're someone who still likes books, and I have to admit I do, you can purchase it at a really reasonable rate.
Yes.
And I mean, the nice thing with this book too is I was able to go through, because it's an e-press and they don't do huge print runs, I could use photographs. They were really encouraged me to put photographs into the book, and that wouldn't increase the production costs too much. So I think, you know, there's a lot of really nice images in the book as well that really capture some of the things I'm talking about.
And if you are watching this at home, of course, you definitely should buy the book. Nikki has a family at home
a starving family to feed, exactly.
A starving family. So what would you say in terms of the core findings of the book? Is it that the changing nature of women's organisations and the nature of gender politics shifts over time depending on political circumstance? Would that be the core?
That's one of the key findings. I think more than that, though, when I was writing this book, and I mean this is certainly a theme that's very evident in sort of debate about global politics today, but there was a lot of excitement about the political agency of civil society actors in global politics, and, you know, this idea that as people we're becoming alienated from institutionalised politics, and that the real kind of authentic popular momentum for politics is coming out of civil society. So when I started writing this book, I was really interested in that idea as well, and getting back to that argument that I made earlier about the extent to which, what is it possible for civil society organisations to achieve within a given political context? To me, I think that question is left out of this very euphoric sort of romanticised, idealised notion of what civil society actors can achieve in global politics. And I think it's even more romanticised in feminist literature about women's organising. So we see a lot of debate. I'll take the example of Kek and Sikink, for example, the book on transnational advocacy networks, where they have a chapter devoted to the question of gender violence and the kind of triumph of women's organisations promoting a human rights lens on gender violence, and that being seen as a very effective framework, the human rights framework, for generating global and local political momentum on this issue, to make gender violence a human rights issue. And I argue in my book, I support that argument to a certain point, but I argue that actually there are a number of different ways you could look at the gender violence issue. You could look at gender violence as growing out of structural conditions that in the Pacific Islands, I think, sort of help generate gender violence as an extremely prevalent social phenomenon. So there are structural conditions that fuel gender violence as well, and that kind of the human rights approach, unfortunately, I don't think in application doesn't really allow for that discussion to take place. And in a place like Fiji, it has actually been quite a politically prudent and safe agenda to promote in an ironic way. Because what it means is that generally human rights values are articulated through kind of debate about juridical structures. How can we improve juridical structures to better safeguard women's security? And I think that has allowed women to promote, to generate greater attention in Fiji to this issue, but it hasn't really ruffled the feathers of political leaders in the same way that a discussion around the structural drivers, the economic conditions and the political disempowerment is much more controversial and will generate a much more hostile response. And particularly in Fiji, if we look at militarism, for example, as a kind of let's say, a set of structural conditions that do contribute, I think, in some ways to extreme levels of violence occurring in that country too.
So the current Fijian military leadership has indicated a transition to democracy is on the cards. Do you see that as being a progressive step in terms of women's organisations? What are some of the future challenges and opportunities for those organisations in Fiji?
Well, look, I think I want to be optimistic. I do want to be optimistic. But that, we've seen a number of constitutions developed over the last few years, since independence, since the 1970s. I think this will be, what would it be, 1, 2, maybe 4 or 5 constitutions since the 1970s. So we're there now working on the current set of constitutional negotiations and having hearings around the country. This is not the first time this has taken place. The feedback I'm hearing, through discussions with online media and so forth, is that it's actually been quite hard for women's organisations to get access to the constitutional hearings. Some have had access to the current round of hearings that are taking place under the military regime. Some have had access, but other groups, youth groups, groups advocating for same-sex sexualities, they're finding it harder to get access to these negotiations. I think, we need to recognise that Fiji adopted a fairly progressive constitution in 1997 that was the product of a similar range of hearings that really tried to bridge some of these communal divisions and, was very progressive on issues like same-sex sexuality. So, yeah, I want to be optimistic. I want this one to hold true. I want people to own it. That would be fantastic for Fiji. I don't want them to see this coup cycle, which is what many people are talking about, the country being stuck in a coup cycle. I don't want to see that continue. No one wants to see that continue. But I guess it's really a matter of those election results in 2014 being seen by the people as legitimate. And I I don't know what the future holds, to be quite frank. I don't think anyone really does.
Sure.
It's a brave person that makes predictions about politics in Fiji
Yes.
these days.
Well, politics in general in our game, I think it's a mug's game, the prediction game. But the one final question, you found out only a week or so ago that you were you successfully applied for an early career researcher award. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Your research project for that builds in some ways on the research for this book. Can you talk a little bit about the future project and what we'll be talking about the next time we're sitting here discussing the next book?
Oh, if only, I hope so. Well, as I said right at the start, this study was begun when I first started my PhD as a comparative study looking at gender politics in Fiji, Vanuatu and New Caledonia, and I concentrated on Fiji. This new study that I'm starting, or I've already been doing some work on it this year, really looks at the issue of gender violence in Fiji, Vanuatu and New Caledonia, and it takes on this human rights framework. And I guess what I'm aiming to show is that a lot of the debate in the Pacific Islands region really emphasizes the importance of understanding gender violence as a violation of women's human rights. And the argument is that we need to put in place better structures so women can actually actualize this rights of gender, if you know what I mean, through law, generally, as I said, through legalistic kind of measures. But what I'm really interested in is thinking about the possibilities of developing an approach to gender violence that focuses not so much on the human rights agenda. I think it's important, but I think we've put too many eggs in the human rights basket. I'm really interested in empowerment approaches, and I'm taken there really by evidence from New Caledonia, where you see particular structural conditions in place which have allowed women to gain a very significantly elevated level of representation within the territorial parliament, as well as an important level of standing within Indigenous culture as well. So I think the question of socio-cultural, or maybe I should say socio-political empowerment, and how that provides women with a kind of platform for resisting gender violence. There's important evidence to support this claim coming out of New Caledonia, particularly within the Indigenous community there. So I want to look at how those conditions are absent or present in the other countries, and see if actually what's occurring in Kanak society and within the political realm in New Caledonia is really something that should be better understood across the region. And the reason that it's not better understood is that New Caledonia, of course, is a francophone territory. And so it's just a plain linguistic problem of people not really understanding, not being able to speak the language and understanding the developments that have been occurring there. But I think it raises broader questions too about, I guess, just the limitations of the human rights framework. And, while it's been much celebrated in feminist circles and gender politics circles, I think we need to say, okay, we've had 20 years now that we've been talking about gender violence as a violation of women's human rights. Everyone got very excited about this breakthrough in global policy terms, this human rights breakthrough. But we haven't seen any practical abatement of levels of gender violence in the ensuing 20 years. So I think we really need now to start to think about new approaches to this problem.
Fabulous. Well, look, that sounds like a really exciting project, and please do go out and download if you're financially insecure, if you have any sort of money. We're in the lead up to Christmas. It really is an ideal gift for that special someone. Situating Women by Nicole George. And thank you, Nikki, for coming in today and speaking to us about your research. And we'll see you next time for another Research in Focus discussion in the near future.